What's the Real Story by Todd Davison. Before I begin, I would like to take time to acknowledge the unceded territory on which I live, work, and play. I'm creating this presentation on the lands that the Kwantlen, Saanich, Stolo, Tsawwassen, and Katzie people nurtured and cared for since time immemorial. I'm Todd, and my presentation is about the lobster fishing dispute occurring on the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nations. First, I'll introduce my article, then explain the background of the conflict, and then explain why I believe the article is quite biasedly written. My article was written by Mark Montgomery entitled Nova Scotia Lobster Dispute, New Year, New Dispute. It was published on the CBC's Radio-Canada International website, supposedly a media source without political leanings and considered neutral in its reporting. The main voices mentioned in the story are the Sapé-Kinikitik First Nations and the Pawletek First Nations. Also discussed are the commercial fishing interests. The Government of Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans are mentioned, as are the RCMP. Finally, the Supreme Court of Canada is also important to the article. The current fishing dispute began in September 2020 when the Sapé-Kinikitik First Nations announced that they would be opening a fishery and providing lobster licenses to its members based on the 1999 Supreme Court's Marshall decision regarding inherent treaty rights. Mr. Marshall had appealed to the Supreme Court after being arrested for fishing eels and selling them outside of the prescribed fishing season. The Supreme Court upheld his treaty rights to fish based on the peace and friendship treaties of 1752, 1760, and 1761. Here is the text of the treaty being used. Let's take a look at section number 4. The Supreme Court ruled that based on this section, Indigenous people have the right to earn a modest livelihood off of their traditional hunting and fishing. As you can see, there are no regulations in the treaty that limit where or when they can harvest these foodstuffs. Immediately after the Marshall decision in 1999, Indigenous fishers prepared their boats for fishing based on these treaty rights. This angered non-Indigenous commercial fishers, which led the Supreme Court to issue a clarification of what they meant. The Supreme Court explained that a modest livelihood is a 20th century interpretation of what were called the necessaries in the original treaties. They said that a moderate livelihood is basic necessities like food and clothing and housing. The court also said that Indigenous fishers would have to comply with the DFO fishing regulations, and that a moderate livelihood did not mean an accumulation of wealth without limit. Interestingly, in this clarification, the court put a limit on how prosperous Indigenous people could be, a limit which is not imposed on commercial fishers. Returning to September of 2020, the Sapé-Kinikitik issued a total of 7 lobster fishing licenses of 50 traps each to their members, beginning with the son of Mr. Marshall. After these licenses were granted, Indigenous lobster fishers set their traps off the coast of Nova Scotia. Similar to what happened in 1999, immediately commercial fishers began a violent protest. They cut the lines of the lobster traps and destroyed other traps on shore. They sank fishing boats and harassed Indigenous people both physically and online. They also barricaded access to stop Indigenous fishers from exercising their treaty rights and set fire to the Indigenous fishery buildings and vehicles. During these violent protests by white fishers, the RCMP and DFO provided little support to the Indigenous people, and few arrests were made. In exercising their treaty rights, the Mi'kmaq First Nations see commercial fishing as a way to support their families, and some have worked with the government to create fisheries that bring in needed capital. However, the Sepeknektik and Potlatech nations feel that they have not been duly consulted and open fisheries based on their treaty rights. They also believe the Supreme Court's addition of regulations onto their treaty rights are a false addition to the true nature of the treaties. Now that you have an idea of what's at stake and who's involved, I'll discuss the article by Mark Montgomery. I found that his writing is considerably one-sided, and then he seems to blame the indigenous people involved for what happened. Further, much of the violent acts that are occurring are either absent or minimized. First, I'd like to take a look at the writing of the article and how it has negative connotations, and then I'll take a look at the content itself. Nova Scotia Lobster Dispute. New year, new dispute. What I believe Mr. Montgomery is saying with this title is, can you believe that they're at it again? When will these indigenous stop fighting back and just give up their fish already? This flippant title does little to explain the gravity of this situation, its violent nature, and its seriousness. This title completely dismisses the struggle for rights by an oppressed group trying to make a living against violent opposition. This flippant disregard is again demonstrated in Montgomery's misspelling two First Nations names. How disrespectful. The way the author has treated this subtitle as a question again speaks to his sarcastic unbelievability of how far these people are willing to go to protect their rights and safety. Montgomery's questioning their need to call in an outside neutral force that believes in indigenous rights is a colonial way of denigrating the indigenous peoples in this article. The article makes it seem like the Mi'kmaq and First Nations are simply being combative instead of fighting for their way of life. Montgomery makes this a conflict between indigenous fishers and local commercial fishers, when really it's acts of terrorism by white fishers who are scared their continuous plundering of the stolen fishing resource, which they have been overfishing, might partially revert to the group that maintained it for thousands of years. There is no dispute between the Mi'kmaq and the commercial fishers. It's the commercial fishers attacking the Mi'kmaq because of this fear. The only dispute is between the Mi'kmaq and the government trying to set limits on their treaty rights. By the way, I love the guy's sign in the picture. The only reason there are fishing seasons is because of settlers destroying the fishing stocks through greed. There wouldn't need to be fishing seasons if the indigenous maintained control of the fishing grounds as they did since time immemorial. As for out-of-season fishing hurting the lobster stock, Mi'kmaq First Nation submitted conservation plans to the DFO prior to any licenses being issued. Additionally, in total, there are a maximum of 50 licenses at 50 traps per license. This is opposed to the almost 3,000 licenses issued by the DFO for approximately 15,000 traps. Montgomery also discusses the lobster fishing area as designated by the DFO and completely ignores the fact that they are all part of the greater Mi'kmaq territory in which the Mi'kmaq First Nations have a treaty right to fish. He implies that the indigenous fishers are transgressing by violating both the prescribed season and the boundaries imparted by the DFO. His ignoring the Mi'kmaq First Nations division of territory is tantamount to saying the history started at Confederation and traditional lands are now moot. Getting back to the dispute itself, let's discuss how Mr. Montgomery talks about the Supreme Court's Marshall decision on treaty rights. He creates uncertainty by mentioning how moderate living is ill-defined by the court. He then goes on to say that often not mentioned is the addition of the Supreme Court ruling Wait a sec. Is he saying that the Mi'kmaq are intentionally leaving out Marshall Part 2 and that their treaty rights are dependent on the whim of the government? That these sneaky indigenous people are trying to pull a fast one? What is it you're implying, Mr. Montgomery? Sorry about that. I find his tone to be rather disingenuous regarding the First Nations actions. His implication is that they're conveniently leaving out the DFO regulations. However, they're not shying away from the regulations, but are acting in a way they believe is their rights under the circumstances. On the following page, Mr. Montgomery makes it sound like the Sepay-Kinectiq caused the fishing dispute, when really it was the white commercial fishers attacking them that were to blame. His implication of the Sepay-Kinectiq causing this dispute is blaming the victim. Finally, I'd like to look at the unreported violence. Montgomery shows a picture of the fishery being burned to the ground and again implies a two-sided dispute between the Sepay-Kinectiq and the commercial fishers. What's not mentioned is the hundreds of traps lost, the boats being hauled, set on fire, or cut adrift, violent confrontations in person, mob intimidations of both the indigenous fishers, their families, or even lobster customers. The only thing Mr. Montgomery mentions is the lobster pound being burnt to the ground, probably because it's a good visual. Before I forget, remember how Mr. Montgomery questioned the chief of the Sepay-Kinectiq for asking for help from UN peacekeepers? Here's an interview with Sergeant Andrew Joyce of the RCMP after the destruction of the lobster pound.
But again, it seems that last night there were officers witnessing what you described as criminal activity, yet no arrests were made.
It's a measured approach.
A measured approach is a far cry from the militarized RCMP responses to Oka, Ipperwash, Wet'suwet'en, and other indigenous protests. Mr. Montgomery does not call attention to how the white fishers are simply watched and maybe arrested after the damage is already done. I can certainly understand how the First Nations would look for outside help after this type of "let's watch and see what happens" approach from the RCMP, as opposed to the snipers deployed at Ipperwash. A primary voice that is missing from this article is the ancestors who signed the treaties to create a better life for their offspring. As we have seen in our treaty discussions, these people were faced with constant encroachment of their lands and livelihoods by European settlers. They saw treaties as a way to preserve their traditional way of life. Mr. Montgomery glosses over these treaty rights and ancestors who hope to provide for the following 7 generations. Also not heard are the First Nation community members. The violent acts and animosity reach far into the Mi'kmaq community and create tension on a daily basis. When the majority is spouting vitriol about a marginalized group, especially in smaller cities and towns, everyone in the group is affected. Nature itself is also not heard in this article. An indigenous view shows us the earth and its creatures also have a stake in this war. The colonial ideal disregards the lobsters as mere commodities to be harvested and sold for profit. The sheer volume of destruction, 36 million pounds, is a considerable number of animals that are being completely disregarded as lesser beings. Finally, this article gives little voice to the indigenous fishers themselves, people trying to eke out a living and facing considerable violence by doing so. Mr. Montgomery focuses solely on the chiefs and does not mention the strife that is affecting the people getting harassed or arrested for exercising their treaty rights. Thank you for listening to my discussion today. As you may have guessed, I feel quite passionate about this topic and how it has been portrayed in the media. I believe that the article I chose is written in a way to blame the victims, the Mi'kmaq First Nations, for exercising their rights that have been guaranteed time and time again. I have also included 2 quotes that help shed light on the issue, and you can pause the video to read them in full. Finally, I encourage you to investigate this issue on your own time, as it is still ongoing today.